Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. They are Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen, and we have reached the final game week of this 2025 Penn State regular season. Rutgers will be the finish line for Big Ten action. A trip to Piscataway awaits Penn State, and these two on Saturday, 3:30 kickoff at SHI Stadium. We'll have a chance to break that one down a little bit later in the week and give you the latest on how we see this one turning out with our score predictions. And can Penn State get bowl eligible? Both of these teams looking to finish the regular season at 6-6, coming into the matchup with 5 wins apiece. We'll talk about this team's motivation to reach a 13th matchup in the postseason a little bit later here on the show. The Nittany Lions favored by 10.5 points. They're seeking their 18th straight victory over Rutgers. And if you're watching on YouTube, you have seen that my wife has transformed us from Halloween Town to Christmas Town now, which tells you it is getting late on the calendar. And Pat Kraft's time to find a new coach also starting to dwindle. We'll talk about where things stand with this coach search a little bit later to finish up the episode. But first things first, as we always do on Mondays, or at least as we have done for the last 11 following a game week, we bring in Mark Brennan's opinion on the latest matchup. Daniel and I spent about 45 to 50 minutes on our postgame podcast. May have gone an hour. I'm not quite sure. We had a lot to discuss very late/early in Beaver Stadium Saturday night into Sunday morning. We hope you caught that one. Bunch of commentary from a 37-10 victory over the Cornhuskers. A lot about the postgame scene. I want to hear about both of those things from you, Mark, because you were on the field right next to Terry Smith as much of this was going on, walking through the tunnel. So talk about the game, what you saw there, and ultimately what you experienced afterward.
You guys have a problem with Thanksgiving or what in that house? I mean, you're just jumping from Halloween straight to Christmas.
Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday, but yeah, the turkey doesn't get much respect around here. And if I wasn't a little bit more like, hey, we're not doing this yet, November 1st, you would have seen this stuff up behind me. So we had to at least give me a slight buffer before we switch into Christmas mode.
And it doesn't get as much respect at the weekly press conference now that Terry Smith's there as well. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, Tyler, being down there, really cool vibe on the field. I mean, you knew what was going to happen in that game pretty much after the first quarter, and you knew it was going to be his first home win. But to walk out there, and it was loud. I mean, the Terry, it was louder. For most of the season, the window in the press box was open. And for this game, obviously, it was closed, so you couldn't really judge how loud the fans were, but they were very loud. Even though the student section wasn't full, the ones who were there were really into it. And then to be out there on the field after that win was pretty cool. One of the cops, I think, thought he was playing football. I mean, he was getting a little physical in there, throwing his body around, but that's the beauty of Brennan Cam. You're in there getting shuffled around and knocked around a little bit by everybody. Seemed like a genuinely friendly handshake between two former Penn State lettermen, Terry Smith and Matt Rule. And then the way the players just took off, whoever came up with the idea to get those signs out there, I think that was a very smart thing. Wish I would have thought of it. But Anthony Donko obviously was kind of leading the charge, went right up behind the TV people. So it was a pretty wild scene, but congratulations to Terry. And for the game itself, it's, I'll go back to what I said, I think, last week. Where was all this stuff all season? We were talking about it. Complementary offense, right? Simplified defense where you're just getting after it and playing fast and aggressive. I mean, those things I think could have been there all year. And I give Terry Smith credit for finally pulling it not only out of the players, but out of two very highly paid coordinators to get them to finally use some common sense and make the most of the talented hands. So I guess from my perspective, better late than never, but definitely a cool scene on the field. And it was nice to see Terry get that on the field and then back through the tunnel. I mean, it was pretty cool. It was pretty loud. I don't know if the video, if you pick that up, and you could see he was getting emotional again, going through the tunnel. So that part of it was really cool.
I always say, if you want to get a real feel for where Penn State football is coming out of the game, check out Brennan Cam. And that was the case after the Northwestern game in mid-October in a very different way. And I suggest going over to Lions247.com and checking out Brennan Cam from after this matchup. It really takes you in the center of everything. You see a lot of player-coach exchanges. You get a good feel for how the fans are playing off of the opportunity in the moment. And so it's all right there for you at Lions247.com.
Can I say one more thing? This last cam of the year, at least in the regular season, that came about as people making fun of me. That isn't my ego. When I started doing those, I don't know how long ago, there were actually some people in the stands who would yell, "Hey, look at it's Brennan Cam," or people on the beat would be making fun of me. So that name was actually people mocking me, and I just kept it, much like our TV show, which we call the Nitwit. So I know people wonder about that, like, why do you use that name? And it's basically because people were making fun of me for running around with the camera before anybody else was doing it. And now it's a lot of people doing their version of whatever their name is, Cam.
But there's only one Brennan Cam, as we all know. And Daniel, as I referenced, if people missed it, I hope they go check it out. We took a deep dive in Beaver Stadium on Saturday night into what we witnessed during Penn State's 37-10 victory over Nebraska. But as always, I'd like to offer you the opportunity, now that we've had more time to digest, sleep on it a couple times. I hope you got some sleep on Sunday morning. But if there's some things that you've come back up for air on and maybe feel like you want to add to that conversation.
No, I think the one thing that stood out to me was when Penn State announced their in-house players of the game, excuse me, on Sunday. I don't think we highlighted that fake punt in the fourth quarter as much. And as we learned last year when Penn State ran that at Minnesota, that's Dominic Ruli's call as the personal protector. And so, he got to make that call on Saturday. Luke Reynolds again, maybe Luke Reynolds' biggest play of his sophomore year, which you feel good about him for getting that opportunity. And it worked. So Ruli was the in-house special teams player of the game, Zane Durant defense, and then Katron Allen and Nick Singleton on offense. I think that I think we got through a lot of things on Saturday night. I think the biggest takeaway for me is just I think the complexion of this coaching search changing a little bit. I think that's had the longest tail from Saturday night, which, like I said, I'm glad that Penn State fans and players got to have that moment Saturday night, because so much of this has not been about the players over the past couple of weeks. It's been about what's next and whether or not players will be here next year, as opposed to what they're doing right now. So very happy for them. But yeah, again, on Sunday, it seemed like there was a little bit more about not what happened on the field on Saturday, but what is to come.
Yeah, and we'll have more on Terry Smith in just a moment. You mentioned Dominic Ruli getting that special teams player of the week from Penn State staff, and I'm reminded that I think it was late Saturday night, Drew Aller put out a tweet, and it just said Dominic Ruli on it. He was quote tweeting. Are we still allowed to call it tweeting? I don't know. I still do. But he was quoting a post that showed Luke Reynolds. I think it was a 26-yard run off the fake punt. Reynolds, of course, like you said, did that last year at Minnesota, much tighter circumstance, trying to put the game away. But that then directly led to a touchdown for Katron Allen. And we got 8 minutes into this thing, and to kind of hammer home how there are different conversations coming off of this matchup regarding the coaching search, and we've been doing a lot there. Kind of buried a little bit more than you may have anticipated was Katron Allen getting 160 rushing yards, becoming the all-time career rushing yardage leader here at Penn State. Along the way, Nick Singleton scores 2 touchdowns. He has 53 total touchdowns in his career. The next one he scores will push him ahead of Saquon Barkley into sole possession in the record books here at the university. And Mark, it wasn't something that you brought up in the top of the conversation here, but I wanted to give you a chance because we're going to move on from that. But you and I and Daniel, we've all covered every single one of these guys' games together and what they've done as a tandem. And Terry Smith again said the tandem in his post-game press conference on Saturday. And what a fitting moment for both of them to etch their names further into Nittany Lions' legacy on the same field, on the same night, under the bright lights during a victory.
And proof that they were complementary. I mean, Nick did a lot out of the passing game. I mean, one of the long gainers was a short pass that he turned into a long gain, but it was evidence of what has been there all along, what we saw last season and why we didn't see it early this season. I know we want to focus on the positive with these two guys, but I keep going back to they could have been doing that sort of thing all year. And I would also say the complementary football aspect of it. You have Grunk, he only throws 12 passes in the game, but he completes 11, and that makes them play honest defensively. It's not rocket science. And then I still go back, and we were looking when they were going painfully out of their way to balance the number of carries those two guys were getting. And even against Villanova, when they were giving Nick more carries, when that was kind of antithetical to everything they should have been doing. And we were talking about it. It's not as if this is revisionist history. It's who is the guy who's the bruising back, who's going to batter opposing defenses. And that's Katron. And then who's going to take advantage of that? That's Nick Singleton. You're going to get him in some space and allow him to do some things. So it was good to see that play out the way it did. And, after the game, for some reason, they put Katron, becomes Penn State's all-time leading rusher in a cubicle in the back, which I don't even kind of comprehend. But it was fitting in the sense that Singleton was right next to him. So I was actually literally able to have video of Katron and then go over to Singleton. And just to see the way that those two guys have handled all this through the highs and through the lows, and to be kind of ending on a high, we'll see what happens on Saturday. It's cool to see that from them. Yeah. In an era where everything's about me, how much NIL money can I get? Those guys, that's genuine. I don't know if early in their careers, if any of us believed that it was genuine, but you get to this point after what they were through this year, that is genuine. What those two guys, the love they have for each other and the care they have for the football team. So that part of it's been pretty cool to see.
And both of them were recruited with the pitch of, you're going to be our primary guy. You're going to work your way to that spot. And I'll say it again. I said it Saturday night. I think I said it last week. Credit to Jaywan Sider, now in South Bend, working with a very talented running back group for Notre Dame, and what he did for these guys, setting the stage for their senior moment like that. And I'll just go back to this. Three Big Ten games under the direction of James Franklin. Katron Allen averaged 12 carries for 65 yards. 5 Big Ten games since then under the direction of Terry Smith, 24 carries per game, 123 rushing yards per game. Big adjustment there, and it has paid off for this team. And speaking of adjustments, there have been several that have moved the things in a more positive direction from Terry Smith since he took over as head coach. And we know the frying pan he got thrown into week of the Iowa game, leading up to a trip to Iowa City for a night matchup. He's trying to establish some kind of healing process for a locker room that he described as traumatized after James Franklin's Sunday firing. You get a bye week after that, and then you come up and you face the number 1 team in the country and the number 2 team in the country back-to-back weeks. About a half of good fight in Columbus, 4 full quarters of compelling drama against Indiana down to the final seconds, and then a breakthrough with back-to-back wins by an 18-point margin and a 27-point margin. And now that we've gone through that, Daniel, the candidacy of Terry Smith is now a discussion. How much of it is a true, genuine discussion for Pat Kraft? I'm very curious about that. I don't think he thinks that he would be getting this kind of pulse from the Penn State community on November 24th with 1 game left on the regular season. I don't think he envisioned this kind of moment that played out on Saturday. I know he certainly didn't coordinate a lot of what we saw on Saturday, but he was there. He was a few yards away, seeing the guys on the team holding signs that said, "Hire Terry Smith." He heard the chants of Terry. I know he heard what Terry Smith had to say in postgame, which was extremely adamant that he felt like he warranted an opportunity to be the permanent head coach here. And it was certainly more muted today. It wasn't the same, there wasn't exactly the same emphasis from Terry Smith, but he made his case on why he believes he is a top candidate, maybe the best candidate for Penn State's next head coach. And we're going to get to more in the coaching search later, but you're fresh off publishing a story at Lions247.com about Terry Smith on this subject. So what are the top takeaways you want to bring here to the podcast?
Yeah, it wasn't, like you said, I think adamant is the right word from Terry. It wasn't quite that today, what we heard from him. And he did a good job of a lot of the questions he got about his candidacy. He'd give the answer and then loop back to got to beat Rutgers on Saturday. I thought that there were a couple good questions that were asked. We had the report yesterday on Sunday from CBS Sports, Brandon Marcello, that Terry Smith was going to get a formal interview from Penn State. Last week, he told us that he had not had an interview yet, but he viewed his time as the interim coach as his interview. Brian Doan got some feedback from a recruit that it sounded like that interview was supposed to take place today. Terry Smith said that, he said, quote, "I think there will be an opportunity to sit with Pat. We'll just go from there." But I think that getting some insight into Terry Smith's thought process was interesting. He got asked a question, fast forward 6 weeks ago, we're coming out of that presser, with Pat Kraft and Terry Smith, and we are not thinking about Terry Smith as really probably a serious candidate for this role. Pat Kraft says that Smith will absolutely be in consideration, said he'll do anything he can to help him win out, and be a candidate. But I thought that we were all, given how the season had gone, where we thought it would go, we didn't think that Terry Smith would be in this sort of position to maybe leverage this a little bit. So he was asked what changed, and he said, "If I don't speak for myself, who will?" I know that there are a lot of people speaking for him right now, including Michael Robinson on national television, a ton of players in the locker room. Tyler, you published something about that earlier today. And then he was also asked about, hearing, from someone like Michael Robinson on that. And he said that, it means they're doing something right, creating a culture. Let's see what else that we have in here. It was his answers today were pretty brief, as they have been. He said that he loves Penn State. He's open to any possibilities of staying there. Obviously, I would like to be the head coach here. And then in terms of being the best candidate for head coach, he said, quote, "No one knows Penn State better than me. Of all the candidates that are out there, I know the history of Penn State. I know the culture, the DNA. I know the locker room. I know administration. I think I'm a good leader. I'm a leader of men, and that will take care of itself when the time comes." So yeah, I think that Smith, definitely wasn't as forceful today in putting himself out there. I think that he knows that still got to win another game. I think that if you want to be the head coach of Penn State, you lose to Rutgers, might be a little disqualifying, even in a vacuum of what is going on, given the history and how Penn State sees itself. So it's going to be an interesting week. I'm interested, I think on Wednesday evening, it'll be a pretty small group with Terry Smith because of the holiday. Curious if any other questions pop up, if anything else pops up in the coaching search between now and then to ask him. But, I think today he did a nice job of articulately, putting it out there, why he thinks he deserves to be in this position, a little bit removed from the emotion and maybe the adrenaline of Saturday night.
I think adrenaline is a really appropriate word. I think it was pumping through his body. It started to pump through a lot of people during that press conference because you're just picking up on it.
Yes.
And Mark, you brought up the fact that what you witnessed and how unique it was with Terry coming off the field. You want to get into it a little bit in terms of what you heard from his mouth? Pretty uncharacteristic of Terry overall, I'd say, in a public setting. How kind of forceful he got on Saturday, trying to hammer home where he was. He kind of redirected some questions back to, here's why I'm the top candidate. Today was much more of the Terry I think we've come to know, especially in a press conference setting, where more quiet, more measured in his conversation. And yet he did make it clear that he obviously wants to be the head coach at Penn State. I remind people that you've covered Terry for a dozen years as an assistant, as a recruiting coordinator. You've covered Terry as a player here when he was at Penn State a few decades ago. So curious to hear kind of how you would juxtapose those two versions of Smith that we witnessed in recent days, and ultimately what you make of his candidacy and how it's maybe resonating here locally in Happy Valley.
Yeah, I thought it was cool. He was able to puff his chest out a little bit. He earned it. I mean, he earned the right to do that. I mean, he earned the right to talk about himself. As he said, I mean, I look at it two different ways. If I'm not going to say it, who is? Well, former players and current players and a bunch of fans chanting your name, they're saying it. But I know what he's saying is that he's going to fight for his job. And good for him. I would think less of him if he wasn't, right? I don't know. I mean, so to me, there's always been an intense competitor there. When you're dealing with him, BSing with him at a camp, that's a different thing. Or, at a press conference, when we used to get him twice a year, he was always great to talk to, but always very low key. But you watch him on the sideline and you see him getting after officials. You see him getting after players. He mentioned today how sometimes he has to dial it back because he gets on players too hard and he needs to take constructive criticism that he went too far, and he has to learn from that. So I like the fact that he was showing some pride and saying, yeah, I'm the guy. I'm paraphrasing, but he if he doesn't come out and be authoritative and show that level of confidence, why would the administration have any confidence in him. So I like the fact, and I don't know what they're thinking. I have no idea what Kraft's thinking, but to me, if they were ever crazy enough to make somebody like me the AD, I would love to see that confidence brimming from somebody like Terry Smith, who most people would consider kind of a mild-mannered, quiet guy because they haven't seen all those sides of him. But we have at different times in practice and whatnot. So, yeah, I like the fact that he was puffing his chest out.
There's two things that Terry is going to have on his side, especially if they get out of Piscataway with a win, maybe another convincing win like they've stacked up the last couple times out in Big Ten play. One is momentum, because he will have that to finish off a season where we thought momentum maybe was never going to be found for this Penn State football squad, considering how things looked coming out of October and James Franklin firing. It felt like it could be a sputtering team going to the end. That has not been the case. The other is that mojo of being the local guy who you have generating a groundswell of support here. Like he said, no one's going to have that Penn State DNA that he possesses if who takes the job. Some of these guys are outside. I mean, all of these guys we're talking about, they will be outsiders. And quite frankly, a few of them that we've been talking about are lacking on-field momentum right now. And we'll get to that in a little bit down the road here. But some of these guys have stacked up some losses. And we talked about this, Mark, with Daniel on the postgame podcast about Pat Kraft's ability to sell his next candidate if he does set Terry Smith aside. And certainly if Terry Smith ends up on another campus at the end of this conversation, you don't want to bring in a guy who's lacking on-field momentum, because he's already going to be lacking that local mojo that I talked about. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. We're going to finish the conversation here on the podcast with some coaching search updates, because we are, I believe, in the final stretch here for Pat Kraft and his inner circle of decision makers. But Daniel mentioned it. I just want to push it a little bit here on the podcast. I've got a story up on Monday, posted in the afternoon, on what we're hearing from players. You saw the signs during the post game. If you're watching on TV or you were catching it from the stadium, you heard the chants of Terry. But listen to what the players had to say, because we worked our way through the Beaver Stadium media room with help from Mark and Daniel, put together a lot of commentary from a lot of dudes on this team. And just a couple that I wanted to highlight. Dennis Sutton, who's a guy who has personally taken his game to the next level the last few games, and he pointed to the accountability and some of the tough love that Terry Smith has brought. And Terry said he's trying to make the best players on this team feel more accountable, and now they're playing like the best players on the team. He said that wasn't really happening until the recent stretch. Dennis Sutton said he's gotten this train back on track in the midst of chaos. We all looked at him, and he's been a leader for us. And I thought what really stood out to me, I forget if I brought this one to the post-game podcast or not, but I spent some time with Dominic DeLuca, 3-time team captain, a guy who had tears welled up in his eyes talking about the emotion of the night on Saturday. And he said, quote, he brought us back together. He put the broken pieces back together. And I think a lot of this just figured this would be a broken team. Maybe they'd pick up a win here, a win there, but none of us thought they'd be enjoying that moment and that atmosphere in Beaver Stadium late on a Saturday night after kicking the ass of Nebraska. So this is just a team that has reached a different height than I think we thought they might be capable of at 3-6 or after firing James Franklin. And we'll see how much weight that carries for Pat Kraft. And he did mention communication, did Terry Smith, with James Franklin. I think last week after practice, he said those two have been in touch essentially every other day. I mentioned there had been reporting from down in Blacksburg at James Franklin's introduction down there from a couple people on our beat, Audrey Snyder and John Sauber, that they had gathered for dinner last week here. I think when James Franklin probably came up to pack some bags, perhaps get a suit for the introduction. But Daniel, I think some people on our board took exception to this. They feel like it's a red flag that he's talking to someone who's now viewed as an enemy of Penn State by some people. But let's be honest, this is the guy who gave him a huge opportunity at the college football level. He had 1 year under his belt at Temple with Matt Rule, and then James Franklin came calling, knowing about his history at Penn State, knowing about the recruiting influence that Terry Smith could bring in the state of Pennsylvania, especially in that Pittsburgh area. And he became that inner circle truth teller for James Franklin for a dozen seasons. And there's two things here. One is a reminder that Terry Smith is going to be able to pick the brain of James Franklin. That's still happening. He made that clear. And two is the looming possibility that maybe he ends up wearing a Hokies mascot brand on his polo shirt next year and reuniting with James Franklin if he doesn't get the answer he wants from Pat Kraft, or he doesn't feel like it's the best position for him under a new head coach.
Yeah, I thought that to a separate question, Terry was asked, what have you learned, since I think the last time he was asked what he learned about being in the position, and he came back to having to be organized, very organized in this position. And I think we all know that James Franklin was probably the most organized person that a lot of us had ever been around. Definitely more organized than me. And so Terry said that he's talked to him, about that sort of thing, about, the structure, about, being organized. I think one thing too that caught some people's attention is that Terry Smith talked to him about replacing staffers, and the organization in that after those staffers went to Virginia Tech to work for James Franklin. And I think that, some people might have raised their eyebrows a little bit. I think people that view James Franklin, as the enemy now. I think one thing that stood out to me is that if we knew that some of those people were probably going to end up where Franklin was, I think everyone in the Lash building knew, and Terry Smith knew what was to come. And so, I don't necessarily see a conflict of interest in there. And if you're, if you want to know who should backfill for some of those people, the man who made that organizational structure is probably the right one to ask. I know that, it is something that, my ears perked up when Terry Smith said that and was talking about that sort of communication. But yeah, I mean, I think that, they're going to talk. I mean, James Franklin is a mentor for Terry Smith in terms of this position. And yeah, I mean, he knows what he's going through. He knows how to navigate some of these things. I do think that Terry Smith has made it very clear that in a way, he is doing things his way, that there are things that he wants to do that are different, and he is doing some of those things. So it's not like, James Franklin is like the puppet master still, even though he's gone. His influence is going to be on this program no matter what, just because of the type of presence he was at Penn State and kind of the force that he was in terms of bringing the program to this position. Like, even for the next head coach, James Franklin's fingerprints are going to be on a lot of stuff, even if the names are different and, and the numbers are different. And so, yeah, I mean, I think if you're Terry Smith, got to use any resource you can in this spot. James Franklin is a good one.
Yeah. Switching over to individual players and what's progressing on the field. I asked Terry Smith about Ethan Grunkemeyer, and I asked Ethan straight up a couple of weeks ago, I think going into the Michigan State game, if he was viewing this stretch of the season, November, as not just an opportunity to get better game by game, but to build his case as the quarterback of the future for Penn State football. And I think kind of between the lines, maybe for somebody else who might be considering bringing in a transfer portal quarterback if it's not a fit for him here. And of course, at that point, he really gave the 1-0 answer, which I totally respected. But he also said that if this is a fit for him, he wants to be a long-term piece of the puzzle here at Penn State. And Mark, while the Michigan State matchup didn't really showcase much from Grunkemeyer, he had that 75-yard pass. He was under duress at times, but he only threw 2 passes after halftime, and one of them essentially looked like a handoff to Devontae Ross for a touchdown. Again, they led with the ground game, which Terry Smith has repeatedly said they want that to be their identity, and they have lived up to it in the way they have called matchups here lately in wins. But Grunkemeyer, 11 of 12 on the night against Nebraska. This is one of the top pass defenses statistically in the Big Ten entering the matchup. And he averaged, this is something that Terry pointed out, despite the low total of passes they asked from him, when they had a big lead, when they had the ground game working, when they had the offensive line getting a push, he averaged about 15 yards per attempt. And that's not where this offense has been lately. They were able to dial some things up. He was able to find some guys open. He was also able to work on his own behind the line of scrimmage. There was that one throw to Devontae Ross where it was kind of an improvisational moment for Ethan Grunkemeyer. So from what you've seen, Mark, what kind of a case is Grunkemeyer making for whether it's Terry Smith, or who, by the way, said he feels like there's been kind of a slingshot moment for Grunkemeyer in recent weeks in terms of his development, or maybe the next coach who comes in terms of where Grunkemeyer fits in the conversation, the guy who's only a redshirt freshman right now?
Yeah, Terry talked about the offense being the identity. You have it here on our notes, being the ground game. But through 3 quarters, Penn State against Nebraska, 171 rushing yards, 161 passing yards. So it's balance. That's what we were talking about all year. They have to kind of find that balance. And I think in Grunk, you have a guy who can fit perfectly with this kind of offense where you don't necessarily have to throw it 35, 40 times per game. You do enough to again, keep the defense honest against your ground game. and go from there. I mean, he only threw one pass in the fourth quarter, so we can't really, take that into account because they were just trying to run clock. But no, I think from his on-field, in terms of pure numbers, once he started to cut down on some of the interceptions and whatnot, but also the way he kind of handles the huddle. I mean, he was great in the huddle in two very difficult, places. Iowa and Ohio State, there were no issues there whatsoever. That may sound like a backhanded compliment, but it's not. I mean, that's part of the whole deal, to be able to go in there and manage the team and communicate to everybody. That's a big thing. So yeah, I look at those stats through three quarters at what Penn State was able to do. And it wasn't just the ground game. It was the ground game making the running game better, or the ground game making the passing game better, and the passing game making the ground game better. And I think he was a big part of that. To me, I mean, as well as K-Tron played, I think a lot of that had to do with the offensive line. I thought Grunk was their MVP in terms of players. I made Terry Smith my MVP overall just because of the way he's managed Penn State through a mess of a season coming out of the Nebraska game. But for me, Grunk, what he did, he kept the defense honest, and he was nearly perfect. I mean, a 245 quarterback rating. I was looking. They don't have it in the record book, but I mean, that has to be like close to a record at Penn State, I would imagine.
Yeah, it was impressive. It was efficient. That's the word that Terry Smith used. And an important number here also is zero turnovers, back-to-back games now from Ethan Grunkemeyer. And I think something that shouldn't be lost in the shuffle when it comes to the quarterback, Daniel, is how many moments have there been since this guy got thrown into the fire with a really tough slate of Iowa, Ohio State, Indiana, two of those on the road. Even through those games, and certainly in the last couple, he has not been a guy looking toward the sideline with a questioning face, with flailing his arms, being like, what am I supposed to do next? The flags going up from the officials on pre-snap penalties. That has been a really underrated dynamic, I think, when you're watching a first-time starter going through the storm, as Terry Smith likes to call it, and coming out the other side as someone who is confident. The way he carries himself, you can tell this with Ethan Grunkemeyer. He's a motivator of his teammates, and I think that we've seen that he's a pretty cerebral kid in terms of managing a game, avoiding mistakes, and keeping the other 10 guys around him on the same page.
Yeah, I was rewatching the game a little bit yesterday. I had it on in the background while I was doing some work, and I think it was the Singleton touchdown right before the half. Grunkemeyer sprints into the back of the end zone. The rest of the team hasn't even gotten to the back of the end zone to celebrate yet. And he's pumping his fist, jumping around. I think a good thing that Terry Smith and Penn State did after those first two games as a starter is that it really does feel like they empowered him. I know that Terry Smith said at the Indiana game, we made the calls to throw it down the field or whatever it was. But, I think that giving him that confidence, I think was really important. We've talked about the average depth of target, a lot. The fact that it was so low in those first couple of games, and the fact that it's gone up, above 7 yards. I know nationally, someone made this point to me that it still ranks below all these different people. And it's like, in the context of what we were seeing in those first two Grunkemeyer starts, this is a downfield passing offense. It's changed.
And before Grunkemeyer starts, let's be honest, even with a guy who started 30 games in his career and had this all-world arm, they weren't flinging it down the field with Drew Aller either.
Yeah, and so I think that Grunkemeyer is empowered. I think that he's someone that, we see that emotion from him on the field, but I feel like he's someone in the huddle who, keeps his pulse in check. I think that I mentioned that in some of our interview sessions with him or whatever. Boring isn't the right word, but he seems like a little flat, in terms of his affect and his answers. But you can tell that, he has an emotion, that he's there. And I think he's playing really confident right now. One thing I didn't mention at the top that I noticed yesterday was, you look at the receiving box score and you look at the longs for each players, 29, 50, 31, 28, 20. And really that 50 by Nick Singleton, that's the only one of those that, was a significant catch and run, I think. You look at it, and Kobe Howard had 13 yards after the catch. Hudson had 2. Pena had 29. It wasn't okay, he's just going to dump it and the pass catcher is going to do all the work.
Horizontal,
yes,
like it had been, right?
Yeah, it was really vertical, and he found guys open. I think there were times when they were wide open, we could see it, there's the guy, is he going to throw it? And he did. So I think Grunkemeyer is playing really confident right now. And I think probably the best way to frame it is that he's been empowered these last couple of weeks.
You mentioned we saw big gains through the air downfield to guys like Kyron Hudson and Trevor Pena and Kobe Howard, the freshman, stepping up. The guy who got into the end zone as a receiver on Saturday night, it was a big rushing performance, as we know, and Nick and Katron both had 2 touchdowns apiece, but Andrew Rapplier was on the receiving one, and that came off play action. Let's not forget, play action is now actually in play for Penn State with an established offensive ground game. We hadn't been able to see that much, and I know a lot of us were asking for more of it, but Andrew Rapplier is now in 5 consecutive games been at 30-plus snaps. In 4 straight games, he has been in the starting lineup. The first 11 to trot out there off the sideline, he's been a part of that conversation. You've seen Khalil Dinkins and Luke Reynolds continue to get starters reps, essentially. All 3 of these guys routinely surpassing 30 to 40 snaps on a game-to-game basis. But I think you both noted at the Michigan State game and before and during and after, kind of the way that Andrew Rapplier engages, not just with his own team, but with opposing players, with the opposing crowd. He is a shit talker. I mean, we've seen that since we got to know him at the high school level. I think it's apparent to everybody. Terry Smith referenced that today during his podcast, but he also is quick to say he backs it up. And Terry Smith, I love this line from Smith. He said, he's the guy that you don't want to meet in an alley because he doesn't know the end of the fight. He just going to keep pummeling you. And you've seen that. He called him a road grader. He gave him credit along with the offensive line and someone who's really making an impact in being able to get Katron Allen and Nick Singleton into space and building up these long possessions that have kind of broken another team's spirits in the last couple of weeks. And so I think just keep an eye on Andrew Rapplier, because Terry Smith gave another line there. He said, when I say Terry Smith tough, that's the guy that's first in line. And so keep that in mind when you're talking about roster retention and who's going to be important to keep on the field, off the field. Andrew Rapplier is rising up that list. And he's a redshirt sophomore. He's got a couple more years of eligibility. He missed all but the season opener last year because of a pretty rough injury. And so you're starting to get reminded of what he can do as a receiver and as a pass blocker, as a run blocker, and additionally, the kind of mindset he brings. He's the guy that you hate to play against. I mean, you absolutely hate playing against this guy, but you love it when he's on your side. You love playing with him. And Andrew Rapplier is just, I think, a name for everyone to keep on your radar. Number 87 out there when they hit the field against Rutgers. And Mark, going over to defense, you asked about the collective effort of that group, and they've been playing faster. They've been more aggressive. They've been more productive. They've been holding teams in check, back-to-back games where they've only given up 10 points on the game. And you basically said in simplest terms, Terry, why is this the case? And look, Jim Knowles is starting to look a lot better. But I think that Terry Smith and whatever kind of conversation and truth-telling happened in the last month has played a role in what has been adjusted and is now working defensively.
Yeah, Terry said, so over the course of time, you're going to get better naturally. I think we have simplified things and slowed it down and took away some of the 3rd and 4th options. I mean, come on. I mean, 3rd and 4th options for a defense, and when your 1st and 2nd ones aren't working. I mean, I think we're seeing you're able to get a guy like Alex Tatch in there now and play. You're able to get a guy like Darius Dixon in and play. I mean, I'm not saying these aren't smart players. I mean, they're very smart. But there was too much there for the entire defense, obviously, for most of the year. And now that you've taken some of it away, you're starting to see the success. You're also seeing guys playing free and loose and confident. I mean, it's just that was gone for so long. There was people were hesitating. They weren't just cutting loose and getting after it. It was as if they were afraid to make mistakes. And now, what do we see in each of the last 2 games? Mistakes were made, right? I mean, against Michigan State, long touchdown run. Against Nebraska, long run, 50 whatever yards early in the game, and they recover and play well the rest of the way. So, yeah, I think it's been addition by subtraction, and it's worked out well for them.
Daniel, when we look at those burned red shirts, you asked about it directly to Terry Smith today. Mark brought up Alex Tash. He burned his red shirt on the opening kickoff of this game and then was involved in the second defensive series. And we saw him at linebacker really over different spots in this game. He's clearly a part of the plan now on defense, which he wasn't for the first half of this season. But behind the scenes, if it was even possible for a player named LeVar Arrington, he has burned his red shirt as well. Another freshman linebacker. Arrington has not yet got involved on defense. And I can't tell you, I don't think I've ever seen a player who didn't have a kind of defined role or rotational piece of the puzzle on defense or offense and had his red shirt burned here at Penn State. This is the first for me seeing a guy do it all on special teams, and that's what LeVar Arrington has done. What did you pick up from Terry Smith's answer to your question? You asked about a couple guys, and by the way, we're now up to what will be at 5 burn red or 6 burn red shirts on the season. Ivan Kamaju, Chaz Coleman, Kobe Howard, Alex Tash, Darius Dixon, and LeVar Arrington II. I cannot tell you how hard it is to count and try to remember all these things while you're recording a podcast in live time, but I think I did it. And so what did you make of Terry's answer?
Yeah, I mean, it was hard to keep track during the game. Like I triple checked the game notes to make sure, and was trying to remember back to every kickoff we've watched over these past couple of weeks. Yeah, I mean, Terry Smith said that it's been conversations that they talk to everyone who's around a kid. Their parents. He said that they talked to Tash's high school coach as well, and they just came to the determination that this is the best thing for this player. When Alex Tash was asked about it last week by Max Rowell from Penn Live, essentially like some might argue it's the better decision for your career to take the red shirt this year and then regroup next year. But Alex Tash said that he's got a ton of trust in Terry Smith and Dan Connor, and that they would not steer him wrong. And so I thought that was interesting feedback to hear. I also think that it plays into how Terry Smith is running this team a little bit in terms of empowering these guys, wanting them to go out, play free, not think about things too much. So yeah, I mean, he said that, they talked to, I think he said Big LeVar was how he phrased it, about, what would be best for LeVar II. This is the determination that they've come to. So it is interesting. Like you said, my 5 years here, it's if someone burns their red shirt, you're seeing them on one side of the ball. Even if it was someone like Kobe Howard, where it was only a little bit here and there. So a little bit of a surprise, but we'll see.
I'm reminded of New Year's Day 2022, just before you joined the good guys over here with us, Daniel, your last game as a non-Lions 24/7 member. But They were down linebackers. They had to move Jesse Luketa back from defensive end to linebacker. I think Ellis Brooks was out with an injury in his final game of his college career. And they had 2 linebackers waiting in the wings. Both had played 4 games. One more would have burned red shirt. Maybe would have helped them because Arkansas ran the ball down their throat all day. But at the end of it, Kobe King and I think it was Jamari Budden was the other linebacker. Both of them, Franklin told us after the postgame that it was determined they would not play. They would preserve that red shirt. And it was kind of an embarrassing day for the defense where it looked like a couple capable linebackers could have helped them. And so I kind of was reminded of that situation, not to put any blame on King or Budden or what have you, hindsight being 2020, but different set of circumstances now. And you're seeing them embrace it and LeVar and Big LeVar embrace it. And we're really curious about what number 11 the freshman can do moving forward in his Penn State career, a guy who, because of that name, is always going to be in somewhat of a spotlight. Let's talk about the bowl possibilities. And that's a chance where not only do you get a 13th game here, and Dom DeLuca is a guy who, again, was emotional after this game, and he said he wants to do everything within his power to earn another opportunity to play with these guys. And there's that mindset for guys whose college careers are ending. Some of them aren't necessarily going to be forecasted to have long professional football careers. So maybe the last game that they're involved in at this kind of a level. And then there's also guys like LeVar and Alex Tash and Darius Dixon, where 3 more weeks of practice could really be a big thing. It could really set the stage for you going into next season, next year, with a coaching staff that's certainly going to have some unfamiliar pieces. And Mark, earning a bowl, we talked about it 3 weeks ago when they were 3-6. It seemed like something that maybe wasn't so much of a carrot at the end of the stick. Were these guys just going to be ready to wrap things up? And of course, we should know that when you start stacking wins, the energy changes around the program in the locker room. And these guys seem really bought in on each other, bought in on Terry Smith. And Terry Smith described this Rutgers game as a playoff type game. He said that they've been viewing recent games as that because, quite frankly, if they were to lose either of the last 2 games, we're not talking about bowl eligibility here on Thanksgiving week. And he said this is, quote, another playoff game for us in our own reality of the world. And I love that he phrased it that way because there's a lot of people sneezing at this game when you're looking through the Big Ten schedule for the final week of the season. But in Piscataway, they want to get to a bowl game under Greg Schiano. And here, I think more than we anticipated, there is a desire. And Terry Smith kind of said, yeah, there could be a couple guys who end up opting out of this thing for personal reasons or different circumstances. And I think we would totally respect that. I think we respected it enough when guys opted out of a New Year's Six bowl. So if we see guys opt out of whatever bowl they get to at 6-6, I think we understand that. But Terry Smith thinks there'll be some buy-in. And ultimately, this does seem to be something that is part of the equation and where the energy is right now.
Yeah, but whatever we discuss now is going to be more shaped by what happens, as you said, with the upcoming pending decision on who the next coach is going to be. So if it did end up being Terry Smith, yeah, I think everybody would be bought in, or the vast majority. But if not, then, you know, who's looking at other places, you know, who's thinking of going to Virginia Tech, you know, who is more focused on just getting into the portal when it opens. So I think that I think this is one where I've always kind of joked about their one game at a time mentality, but I think this is an instance where they really have to look at it that way, because this could be it no matter what, given what's going to happen with the upcoming coaching search. And I think that's why I know some of the players have been like, oh yeah, you know, I'd be all in, but I think most of them that we've talked to have been kind of, they haven't been negative about it, but they haven't been like, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to be, you know, all up for, you know, whatever's coming, because they know. I mean, they understand that they're not sure where this program's going to be a week from now, 2 weeks from now.
You make a great point, because I think when guys say we won a 13th game together, they're including Terry Smith as the leader of that conversation. And if Terry Smith is, you know, if he's moving on to another program because he's not getting the head coaching job, or a new head coach is coming over and you're working with kind of a bare bones crew, and yeah, it's a totally different circumstance. And Daniel, something else we heard regarding the subject that Audrey Snyder asked today, and it was a good question because could prove very valid in the weeks to come, is how is he going to handle when guys enter the portal? If you didn't pick up on this, people, when a player entered the portal under the James Franklin regime, they were off that run. Like, you couldn't find them on the web database within moments. Like, they were off the roster. I'm assuming their locker was cleaned out. They weren't persona non grata, but they weren't a part of the program anymore. And Penn State kind of did a parting of ways as soon as possible when they got news of players was entering the portal. Here in this case, Terry Smith says circumstances are different. There's a lot hanging in the air. So you could see players, again, you can't enter the portal. None of these guys are actually going to actually do that officially until January when that thing opens up. But you could see players declare their intentions to enter the portal and perhaps still be practicing with this team, perhaps still be preparing to play in a bowl game. Again, I think that kind of comes in with Terry Smith's status on it. But Daniel, one way or the other, Pat Kraft's decision could drastically impact how excited this campus is, or especially in the Lash building, for, you know, a trip to the Bronx for the Pinstripe Bowl, or a trip down to Nashville for the Music City Bowl. Either time you're facing a Power 5 opponent, ACC opponent, maybe even Pitt in the Bronx, and then an SEC opponent down in Nashville. But at the same time, the dynamics could change in a significant way between now and then.
Yeah, to go off what Mark said, I think that from a couple guys we've heard, yeah, we're motivated to get bowl eligibility. Like, we want to get the 6th win. We didn't necessarily hear, I want to play in the whatever bowl. Like, I want to play. I'm going to play in the bowl game. I think that there is an element of getting that 6th win is pretty symbolic, because you're a 500 team. You know, you are bowl eligible. Like, those are like the streaks, and that's kind of how your program is measured in some respects, by how many bowls do you get to, all of that stuff, not necessarily what happens in those bowl games, who plays in them. Another thing too, I think it's really easy to talk to guys in a post-game locker room after a big win, and for them to say, like, yeah, I'm all in. Like, you know, even if guys were saying, like, yeah, I'm going to play in a bowl game, like, I want to. Another thing, you know, December 7th, when, you know, they're sitting down with, you know, their advisors, their business people, when a decision is potentially made on the future of this program, who's going to be the coach, what the options are, what's best for them. You know, I think that changes the shape of things a little bit too, because this team is so senior heavy. There's a ton of guys. You look at the starting lineup on both sides of the ball that are going to go to the NFL. And I think that even if Penn State was like 9-3, just misses the playoff, we wouldn't really, you know, think twice about some of these guys opting out to prepare for the NFL. You know, I do think the portal opening on January 2nd, interesting dynamic. And like you said, Tyler, like, guys can practice, guys can play. Even if they say that they're going to go into the portal, they can still finish out the year, finish out their Penn State careers if they really want to. Like, we'll see. I think that's like, there's a lot of stuff that is really easy where we're sitting now in the timeline to say that we could see things playing out this way. But this is pretty untrodden territory, I think. I'm not necessarily going to say it's unprecedented because I haven't tracked every single postseason scenario for teams over the past couple of years, but it feels pretty unique, especially when you factor in that there is, grassroots support on the roster for the interim, and in terms of what this could look like if certain decisions are made, if things go a certain way.
And to steal a perspective from you, Daniel, because I think you always do a great job of circling back and saying, don't you want to see your team play for 60 minutes and be successful? You only get 12, 13 opportunities to see Penn State football in action on a field. The rest of it is spreadsheets, speculation, feature stories. You actually seen football. Hey, maybe Vega Ioane doesn't play in the Pinstripe Bowl, but wouldn't you like to see Cooper Cousins get 50 reps and see what that looks like? Maybe you don't see Nick Singleton and Katron Allen building upon their career-setting numbers, but what the hell is else going on at running back? We don't know. No one's gotten a carry in Big Ten play. Wouldn't you like to see Corey Smith maybe get 15 touches over the course of a matchup against a Power 5 opponent? And you work your way through the entire roster and pick a guy, Zane Durant. Okay, you'll see less of him, but maybe Liam Andrews gets a chance to play a little bit more at defensive tackle. You can kind of work your way through each position group, and I think it is important to note that. And look, let's get to that coaching search, because to remind people, we won't know what bowl Penn State is definitively going to, like on Saturday night. There's going to be the conference championships next weekend, that first weekend of December. Then you're going to have the playoff committee to get together and have their selection of how the 12 teams stack up there and put the tournament together. So that first Sunday of December is when we'll get an answer if Penn State's at 6-6, where they are headed. Again, I think our preferences at least would probably be the down in Nashville for the Music City Bowl against an SEC opponent, or over to the Bronx for the Pinstripe Bowl against an ACC squad. But there are other options out there, and I think Daniel will probably do some bowl projections or something maybe this week over at the site if you're really interested in them. But between now and then, do we have an answer from Pat Kraft? By the time a bowl game is determined, do we know if Terry Smith's in or out, whether he's a head coach or an associate head coach or whatever involved with this program? Will we have that answer by the time a bowl game's announced? Will we know who the next head coach is? And just to work our way through that before I send it to you, Mark, and just get some final words from you on where you think Pat Kraft's head needs to be at right now, because this is crunch time. He has had 6 weeks. The reason why you make this move, other than feeling like your program trajectory is trending in the wrong direction and you want to try to salvage the locker room, however Pat Kraft phrased it on October 13th, part of the reason you make that move 6 games in is to give you a head start on finding the replacement for James Franklin. They've had a lot of collection gathering. They've had a lot of interviews. We've done our best to track it all over at Lions247.com. We thank you if you've been a part of that. But Eli Drinkowitz has been like the most consistent name from our vantage point for 6 weeks now. But Missouri hasn't played so hot. They've beaten who they're supposed to. They haven't beaten who they're not supposed to. They've had a quarterback injury. Bo Prabula was back last week. They scored 6 points, and they lost to a ranked opponent. And Drinkwitz is a guy that feels like he's not exactly the priority for Penn State, not exactly the priority for LSU, for Florida, for Auburn, and yet he's in the conversation for each of those jobs. And you're kind of waiting for Lane Kiffin to make up his damn mind, and God forbid Lane Kiffin give anyone a straight answer ever, because that will set the musical chairs going, especially with those SEC jobs. Drinkwitz, to me, I still think he's a good bet to end up leaving Columbia, but I'm not convinced that anyone views him as the guy right now, including Penn State. Bob Chesney, of late, has been a hotter name. Everyone's kind of viewing him. Is this the next Curt Cignetti out of JMU? He's got that program in a really good place. In the past, he's worked his way up. Division II, FCS, at different levels of football, he has had success, but he has never been a member of a power conference coaching staff. We did see Curt Cignetti as an assistant coach at this level. He has never been in a building at the power conference level. And to me, we're in a situation that regardless of JMU goes 11-1 in the Sun Belt Conference, that's a particularly tough sell if you're saying, Terry, thanks, but no thanks, Pat. If Pat's taking that approach and saying, we're going to bring in this guy who's never been on a power conference campus and give him the keys, and Terry Smith's not going to have this job, I think that becomes a dynamic now that's in play, those things being juxtaposed and scrutinized a little bit, because there is a public perception here that Pat Kraft needs to navigate. And everything I've gathered about Pat Kraft is he cares quite a bit about public perception. Brian Hartline, I think you stash him on the back burner where he's always been. I just don't see him as being a guy that they're going to turn to right now. I think it's going to be a sitting head coach. It's been interesting to hear his name bounced around. There has been communication between the two parties. Someone's going to hire this guy as a head coach, and maybe he takes off and it makes you look bad for not hiring him. I'm just not reading the tea leaves that Brian Hartline is legitimately in play right now to be the next head coach at Penn State, unless they go through a few other names. And now you have to add Terry Smith to that list. Now, there's been this thing on social media, on our message board, about this mystery man, this mystery candidate. And I'm sure this happens toward the tail end of every coaching search. And you got to wonder, is it just someone trying to throw people off the scent of who's actually involved here? Or is there really someone bubbling to the surface, maybe something brewing behind the scenes that one party or the other doesn't want to get out there because it could jeopardize things? Well, I'll take my shot at jeopardizing things. If I had a guess right now and who this mystery man's identity was, I'd say Marcus Freeman. I don't know this for fact, but I do know that based on conversations I've had with people in the agency industry, people I trust here close to Penn State, he hasn't given them a slam door yet. He has not said no, and they've talked a few different times. And he is cruising at Notre Dame. They're going to be in the playoffs, so I don't understand how that's going to work. Daniel, you did note they have a bit of a tricky test perhaps on the road at Stanford. I think you said it was a 10:30 Eastern time kickoff. So that's their final test, but they just put up 70 points against Syracuse. They have been really impressive since starting 0-2. Marcus Freeman, though, his agent has been, and his reps, from what I've gathered, have been urgent and making sure his name is floated out there as much as possible. I still think that if he leaves South Bend this cycle, it's going to be for an NFL job. But if I'm guessing the identity of this mystery man and who we might hear between this podcast and the next one, or in the final week of this process being in the mix all of a sudden, keep an eye on Marcus Freeman. I'll just put that out there. And now, Mark, now that I've kind of given my spiel, and I'll go over to the coaching search board and try to relay as much as I can over there as well. What do you think is on the table for Pat Kraft in terms of what he needs to get right to avoid this becoming a multi-year issue for him and a headache and one that could be career defining for him here in State College?
We may not know who the coach is on Selection Sunday, but he better know who it's going to be. I mean, we know how these things work, talking with agents and whatnot, and he better have a really good feel.
Mark, sorry. We're going to be like, what the heck, Tyler? Kalen DeBoer, everyone. I'll be shouted from the rooftops.
Yeah.
I mentioned him earlier, and we talked about him a lot last week. He is firmly in play from what I gather. I know people down in Alabama and Tuscaloosa, I respect their reporting. People close to that situation are kind of throwing cold water on that. But to be honest, if something is in the works, they're going to be the last to find out. People who are close to DeBoer, right, they're going to be relaying what he wants out there. And I still think that if they were to lose to Auburn this Saturday in the Iron Bowl, you might be surprised to know it's less than a touchdown spread in the eyes of bettors. There's a possibility for an upset there to finish with back-to-back losses in SEC play to Oklahoma and to Auburn. And Auburn's pretty lowly right now. They're under 500. And again, they lose that. They're not going to the playoffs. That's back-to-back years where they've got 3 losses in the regular season, and people are getting toxic down in Tuscaloosa. They're not all that thrilled with him right now. Imagine if they lose to this Auburn team on Saturday. I think that we all have to be really cognizant of where that game is going and what it may mean for Penn State. If they win and they're in the playoffs, I have a hard time seeing DeBoer, no matter how much it might be a weird fit right now, walking away from a Crimson Tide team. I don't know how Pat Kraft can justify going into January without a head coach. And so that's where it is right now. I wanted to make sure I mentioned that because people will notice that before they talk about anything I did say.
But to your point, Tyler, of everybody you mentioned, who is a more qualified candidate than Terry Smith right now? Like, who would fans be more behind? Number one, not that's what you're basing it on. You're basing it on who you think is going to be successful, but it's like a whole new dynamic watching football when the team you're covering is in the middle of a coaching search, because all you're looking for is the flaws of every single coach. I mean, Matt Rule, it took him 3 days to take himself out of contention, and not even by getting the contract. I mean, by losing to Minnesota. But, Drink isn't what everybody thought he was. Key, it just lost, was getting pummeled by Pitt and lost that game.
Thanks for bringing him up too. And I've heard that if he is to leave Georgia Tech, it's probably for a Southern campus. So I'll just throw that out there too.
But my point being, and I actually wrote this after the game, and I didn't say the coaches' names, but I said outside of somebody who's at least coached for a national title, Freeman and DeBoer, right? I didn't mention that. I probably just should have. who on this list are you looking at and saying you would prefer over Terry Smith? And I don't know. I don't. I really don't. So I think he deserves to be given an honest opportunity. But getting back to your initial question, if we get to that day, to that selection day, and they haven't hired one of these, one of these other coaches that we're talking about, or they haven't promoted Terry Smith, then I think we're gonna have a pretty good feel. And if if Kraft doesn't know who it is by then, well, then it's a whole nother mess because, as you mentioned, you went into this thing thinking you're going to give yourself a head start. And now if you get to that day and you're behind, I think it's going to be a really bad look for Pat Kraft.
I think you're right. Kalen DeBoer, Mystery Marcus are the only two guys that I could see where you can say, okay, we get it. We understand why this had to be the hire. Good for you, Pat Kraft. That's a hell of a pickup. In those other cases, something we mentioned, I'm just going to bring it back to it on the postgame podcast. I think you risk a pretty broad disassociation between Penn State football and a lot of lettermen. A lot of people reside in that locker room because it's going to be really hard to justify to them why that hire was the right one for Penn State now and long-term versus what Terry Smith could maybe provide you. I just think that's the reality of it in terms of the perception, relationships between Penn State and a lot of people who have put on the Penn State uniform. And Daniel, one more opportunity. I feel like we check in with you once a week and you only have like 1 minute to give your take on the coaching search, which isn't all that fair, but close us out with where you think things may be and where you think things need to get to for Pat Kraft in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about managing public perception and everything that goes along with that, like, feels like it has to be tier 1 or Terry. Like, I think tier 2 and tier 3, like, tough sell. At the same time, like, if you're Pat Kraft and you have conviction about one of these guys that we are putting as a tier 2 or tier 3 guy, and you feel like this is the guy, I'm going to give him everything he needs. We're going to give him the right staff, everything like that. Forget what everyone else says. Like, this is the guy. You got to do it if you're Pat Kraft. I mean, we hear it all the time about you only get to make so many of these hires in your career. And so if you think he's the guy, this is the guy, and you want to, hitch your wagon to him, you have to have that sort of conviction. I think the other thing that I will say is that, the dynamics of Terry Smith getting his interview now is really interesting to me. I know that when we left that media room on October 13th, that we didn't necessarily view Terry Smith as, a top tier candidate. And I think that we all viewed, saying the interim is a candidate for the full-time job is, lip service. I think that we all knew that Terry Smith is someone to be taken seriously. But when you look at the overall dynamics of situations like this, that's just how things go. And I know that there's data about interims that, is pretty unfair in terms of the, types of people that are interims and whether or not they get fair shots. But I do think that if you were Pat Kraft, I'm not getting paid as much as he is to think down the road that, Terry Smith might evidently, to think that Terry Smith, might be a candidate down the road, or that this thing could have happened. I am kind of like, you had the bye week, it feels like it would have been the prudent thing to do to sit down with him, to get that formal interview, to get that on the record, so that you're not in this position where he's coming into this with this sort of momentum, with this sort of backing, with this sort of, I don't know if it's technically leverage, but perceived leverage. I think it's a very interesting dynamic. And like, I think it's one thing for me to say, like, I didn't think we would be in this position on November 24th. It's another for the person who is making, millions of dollars and is in charge of a operation that generates hundreds of millions of dollars to not potentially have this foresight. So that's an interesting dynamic to me. And another thing, just I've gone over this minute. You do wonder, like, in terms of the interpersonal dynamics, how much will be separated as this is business. When you talk about like Terry Smith's potential long-term future at this campus, what is business? Will things become personal? how do you manage that as things move along, depending on the decision that makes. So I think for where we are today, a lot more dynamics at play than I think we thought we would see. And also, sorry, one last thing. I said this to you, Tyler, when we were leaving Beaver Stadium at 4 a.m. But, it does make me wonder about the head start. I know that things might have been untenable in that locker room, untenable with James Franklin, especially how those last couple of games went. But, I do think that, marketing the head start as a reason to make a decision for any college in the future. I think how things are playing out now and this game of musical chairs, who's left, I do think that might throw a little cold water on that as a good selling point in the future.
One way or another, I have no doubt that Pat Kraft will express the utmost confidence in whoever he introduces as the next head coach. And then it'll be for the rest of us to judge over the coming months and years on how it plays out, whoever it is. And we'll keep tabs on things over at lions247.com in the days ahead, maybe weeks ahead. I'm not sure if we're going to get to weeks still on this coaching search, but a lot there for you at lions247.com on our hot board and the thread that goes with it. We'll come back to you with one more podcast. We're not doing our 3 podcasts leading up to a game like we normally do. We're going to let our guys enjoy the holiday a little bit on Thursday. Mark and Daniel, I'm ducking out. I'm going to my in-laws. So sorry, I'm not working as hard as you guys this week. But you will be on the field at practice on Wednesday with a chance to talk to Terry. And I don't think there'll be a lot of people there to talk with Terry. So I think you'll have a good chance to get whatever information you want. So follow our coverage midweek, practice photos and some practice notebook stuff over there. And then we'll get settled in for a matchup on Saturday afternoon in Piscataway between Rutgers and Penn State with bowl eligibility on the line. A lot of stories coming your way on Terry Smith and a lot other dynamics in play right now for Penn State at lions247.com. On behalf of Mark Brennan and Daniel Gowan, I am Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.